2. Now a part of this year's National Conference of the Council of Conservative Citizens. The event was held yesterday just outside Washington, D.C., in Fairfax, Virginia. It began with a discussion of immigration reform. Speakers at this session included a representative from an immigration reform group called Voices of Citizens Together and the president of the American Immigration Control Foundation. The discussion lasts about an hour 45 minutes.
Good morning. We're going to deal with the topic of immigration now. My name is John Benson. I'm president of the American Immigration Control Foundation. And we're going to deal with the question, has the debate on immigration ended? I thought a lot about this, and my thought is that this debate has never really begun. We haven't dealt with this issue at all. The powers that be don't want us to deal with it. But the fact of the matter is that they don't disagree with us too much on what the reality of the situation is. What is happening is this. Each year, the United States takes in 1.2 million legal and illegal immigrants, mostly from third world countries. If this situation continues, within 50 years, our population will grow by 130 million, added on to our current population of 270 million, a massive growth. Within 50 years, the demographic situation will shift drastically. The European American population will become a minority for the first time in our country's history. We in the immigration reform movement don't think that these are good trends for America. They mean, basically, that America will lose her sovereignty, her identity, and her culture, and basically become a colony of the third world. Let me give you some examples of what this means. One difference between our culture and the third world is that we believe in the rule of law. In the third world, the idea basically is might makes right. This is changing in the United States because of immigration. Our view. In California, a gentleman by the name of Mario Obledo, a pro-immigration activist and leading Hispanic activist, said that he didn't like a sign that was put up on a highway in California. It said, "Welcome to California, the illegal immigration state." Obledo threatened to burn it down, and the sign company meekly complied. The immigration reform group that put the sign up tried to have it put up again, but they found out that all the sign companies had faced severe pressure from various political interests not to put the sign back up. Obledo said that the sign was racist. This was the same man who later stated on a radio station, quote, California is going to become a Hispanic state through immigration, and anyone who doesn't like it should leave. He's bothered by racism. I want to tell you the story about a man I talked to in California, the same state, who was having a problem with his tenants, most of whom were illegal immigrants. He was a landowner, a property owner. He had rental property, and he said that the illegal aliens would not pay the rent. They simply refused to do so. So he went to the sheriff, and the sheriff said, well, these people are foreigners, you need to talk to the immigration service. So he called the Border Patrol, and the Border Patrol said, we don't have the manpower to deal with these people. Go to the INS in Los Angeles. He called them, and the INS said, we don't have enough manpower to deal with this problem. So he was stuck with a situation of people not paying their rent. So he said that a man approached him with a solution to the problem. This man was a Mexican gangster, himself an illegal immigrant. And he said that if you'll pay me enough money, I will take care of these people for you. So the rule of law is not prevailing. Might makes right is perhaps going to prevail in this situation. It is true that our immigration authorities don't have the manpower to deal with illegal immigration. In 1986, though, Congress passed a law that tried to remedy this problem by allowing localities to deputize their police forces to assist the Immigration Service. Salt Lake City was ready to go through with this plan, and there was a majority on the city council that said, yes, we want to do this. The council decided not to, and the reason was a large group of Hispanic militants showed up at the council meeting and made it known they didn't like this idea at all. Many, according to the accounts I read, appeared to be recent immigrants. Here again we have the principle of might making right over our principle of rule of law. But you know something? The other side on this immigration question doesn't disagree with us on what we say about our country becoming a third world society. The horrible thing is they want it to become a third world society. You see, it's not really a debate. They agree with us. They want our country to lose its sovereignty and become a colony of the world. One example is the business community, the big business community. So-called conservatives represented by the Wall Street Journal. You know, the Wall Street Journal believes in open borders, which is the same as no borders at all. They believe in mass immigration. The editor of that newspaper, Bob Bartley, has said that he doesn't believe in national sovereignty. On the liberal side, we have our friend President Clinton, who looks forward to the wonderful day when we will no longer have a, quote, dominant European culture in America. Why would they want to destroy our country? Just remember the slogan, it provides the answer. Greed and treason are the reason. See, they like the idea of a third world country because in a third world country, the elites rule, and they are the elites. They don't want to have anyone challenging their authority and power. For the conservative financial elites, the side of greed, they don't want any barriers to their profiteering and money making. They don't want to bother with paying decent wages to American workers. There was one executive in an American corporation I read about who said that it was just awful that American workers were making more money than workers in Mexico. And this man had a salary of a couple of $1 million a year. Another example is a man named George Soros. He recently completed a tour of money making in Southeast Asia, leaving in his wake a number of ruined economies. Mr. Soros is a passionate advocate of immigration. He's formed an organization called the Emma Lazarus Foundation to funnel money into pro-immigration groups in the U.S. The liberal elites, the side of treason, want to break down all national, cultural, and ethnic distinctions because these things stand in the way of their social engineering. They passionately believe in the ideals of equality and social justice. They believe that all men beneath them are equal. And they believe that society should be run by just us socialists. It's a very beneficial relationship for both sides. The financial elites have the intelligence and drive and ruthlessness, and the liberal elites provide them with a moral justification for what they do. It's sort of like the relationship you have in a primitive village where you have the chief who has the spears and the witch doctor who controls the spirits of the people with his voodoo and witchcraft and magic words. Now, the liberal priests have their own magic words they use to control the population, such words as racist, bigot, and Nazi. Reminds me of one time when I was in my office and a man from Yemen called me. He was an immigrant. And he said, "I've read some of your material and I like your organization." He said, I came from a third world country. I wanted to escape the horrible conditions there, and I came here to America, and now these horrible conditions are taking place here. We're turning into the country I fled from. And I said, well, you know, sir, I really appreciate the fact that you want to help our organization, and as a favor to you, I want to teach you some magic words. And if you will speak these magic words, you can have anything you want here in America. He said, what are they? And I said, you are a racist. And he said, yes, those are indeed magic words. One thing, though, about these priests is they're not really holy men at all, as they would have us to believe. They speak against bigotry and intolerance and racism, but they have the most profound hostility toward middle America, patriotic Americans, Christians. You know, they call us Nazis, but it's rather ironic because they borrow a page from the Nazis. For these groups of Americans they don't like, they envision immigration as their final solution. Again, though, they have a lot of power. It's almost like a fairy story when you have a wizard who can take the bravest prince and turn him into a frog. They do it a little bit differently, though. They take brave Americans and turn them into dogs. Let me explain. There's a man I know who was traveling through Georgia, and Georgia is getting a lot of immigration now. And he said that he talked to a man there who was bothered by the situation, but the man said, there's just really nothing we can do about it. And, you know, and frankly, I'm just afraid of these people. We just have to accept this. And my friend is not one to be pushed around, and he was telling me later that what that man ought to have done was just put a chain around himself and called himself a dog, because that's exactly what he was. But you know, there are a lot of advantages these days to being a dog. I mean, if you're a nice, docile, politically correct poodle or a yuppie puppy, your liberal masters will give you all kinds of doggy biscuits. And if you're especially good, they might even give you a bone as well. There's a Southern senator, I won't mention his name, who used to be on our side, but he has according to a man who knows him, a deep sense of social inferiority. And he decided he wanted to ingratiate himself with the liberal elites. And so now he's gone against us on immigration, and today he gets all kinds of doggy biscuits and bones from his masters. He even gets to have an audience every now and then with Madeleine Albright. Some bone. I think the debate now is going to be whether we are going to be dogs or whether we're going to be self-respecting Americans. What we've got to decide to do is to stand up to the elites and organize and not be intimidated by them. And you know one thing, they're not as strong and confident as they would lead you to believe. At least for the time being, there are a lot more of us than there are of them. They want to change that with immigration, but for the time being, there are a lot more of us than there are of them. One thing that gives me encouragement is to reflect on what happened several years ago in New Hampshire when Pat Buchanan won. The elites went absolutely hysterical over this. And their reaction was not the reaction of confident people. When Buchanan began to speak about peasants with pitchforks, they really became afraid and they overreacted. So they're not as confident as they might want us to think. Now again, they have their priest class who will come out and do their mumbo-jumbo, hoodoo, voodoo, you are a racist. But we've just got to stand up to that and know that our cause is right and moral. And when they do this, what we need to do is to remember the words of the Protestant reformer Ulrich Zwingli. He said, resistance to tyrants is service to God. Now I'd like to introduce the rest of our panel. Here to my left is Virginia Abernathy, former professor at Vanderbilt University. Paul Gottfried, a professor at Elizabethtown University in Pennsylvania. Wayne Lutton, the editor of Social Contract magazine. And Glenn Spencer, the president of Voices of Citizens Together, an immigration control group in California. And now I'd like to turn over the podium to Virginia to offer her thoughts and observations.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here this morning and to see so many friends here. I hadn't planned to mention immigration, to mention racism, but since it's been brought up, I will just say that I too have been called racist, and this is ludicrous. I'm not. And furthermore, I know who is hurt first and worst by mass immigration, and it's our own poor, and many of those are minorities. So just on its face, it's an absolutely scurrilous, untrue charge that to oppose mass immigration is, in that same act, racist. Not true. Now, our present immigration policy was set in 1965 by legislation then passed to, quote, reform immigration. At that time, we're having approximately 150,000 immigrants a year, and that had been the pattern for 40 years before then. When the 1965 legislation was being debated, we were promised that never would there be more than about 300,000 immigrants annually. But today, we're getting 1.2 million legal immigrants annually, with approximately 300,000 to 500,000 illegal immigrants on top of that. Notice that the vast quantity of our immigration is legal, including refugees and asylees, so Congress is directly responsible. During the 1990s, approximately 70% of our population growth was caused by immigration and children born to the foreign-born. The foreign-born sector in this country has a much higher fertility rate than do native-born Americans, black or white. The foreign-born in 1995, to take a year, were approximately 10% of the population, but they had 18% of the births. This is propelling us, the direct immigration of about 1.5 billion a year, counting the illegals, and the very high fertility rate of the foreign-born when they're here is propelling us into a population growth rate that looks like the third world. Whereas industrialized countries, Japan, Europe, many others that are industrialized, are fast approaching no population growth. We are growing at 1% a year. Mathematically, this means that we double in 70 years. Projections suggest that we will have 500 million people in this country by 2050. I don't expect to be around, but my children may be, and my grandchildren almost certainly will be. And our communities will be vastly changed by then, and many of our liberties will surely be gone. Let me explain how our liberties go. There are enormous fiscal impacts from immigration. There are enormous economic impacts, and there are enormous environmental impacts from population growth. All of these things lead to taxation, to polarization between rich and poor in the country, where a very small elite controls the economy and the political life of the country, and the environmental degradation which comes with population growth will almost certainly lead to more regulation, the kind of regulation that takes our liberty. Let me first say a few things about the fiscal impacts of immigration. This is the burden on the taxpayer. And in 1997, for example, the net costs of immigration were $69 billion. That is after subtracting all the taxes paid by immigrants or the foreign-born. It still cost us $69 billion as taxpayers. Many of these costs were on local and state government levels. The very largest single cost from immigration is education, schooling the children who are immigrants and the children of the foreign-born, births that would have not been in the United States but for the movement of their parents into this country. I'll give you an example of California, since that's the highest immigration destination state. In California, in order to maintain a current classroom size, they would be having to build one new school of 625 pupil capacity, one new school every day. And if immigration continues at its present rate, this requirement for building schools will continue as far as the eye can see. They cannot afford this. In the meantime, established residents are being pushed out of their communities, pushed out of English-speaking schools because the schools become Spanish-speaking very quickly. And black and white Americans, both, are fleeing California. Therefore, California's population growth is ironically more than 100% due to immigration, because native-born Americans, black and white, have left and continue to leave. Now, population growth in general costs a community money. And I'm speaking now of the capital expenditures that must be made to accommodate new growth: roads, utilities, including schools, energy supplies, recreational facilities, and so forth. Various studies suggest that each added person in a community, whatever the source, costs a community $15,000 upfront costs on average in building. It is not true that a community makes money from population growth and that because it increases their tax base. In fact, the added population requires capital investments which are very costly, and that is just the average for the country. $15,000 upfront costs for each added person. You can intuit this by comparing the per capita taxes paid in municipalities of different sizes. As you go from a community of one size to a community double the size, the average per capita taxes are 25% higher in the larger community. Now I could go on about fiscal costs of growth, and growth, as I said, is driven by immigration. But instead, I think I would like to say a few words about the economic effects of immigration. That is basically the effect on the GNP. Now, there's great publicity given to the fact that immigration creates a growth in our GNP. Well, sure, more people, more money circulating. Most of the growth in GNP, most of the money changing hands goes to the immigrants themselves who are earning wages. So there is a little bit left over net, $1 to $10 billion for the rest of us. Put that against the $69 billion a year, which is costing us net in a higher tax burden. Not only that, but the growth in the labor force caused by immigration creates competition for jobs, and that drives down wages. It drives down wages to such an extent that immigration has been estimated by George Borjas and Richard Freeman of Harvard University. They estimate that immigration is costing wage earners $133 billion a year in lost wages. That money and a little more is going into the pockets of employers. So this is leading to an enormous polarization into rich and poor. What is happening to our middle class? What is happening to our wage earners? It's a disaster. For all of these people, only a very few at the top benefit from this depression in the wage scale. It is destroying the middle class and the spirit and the working class and people who wish to rise in America. Now, I can go on about the growing disparities between rich and poor. We have not seen such a disparity between rich and poor in the United States since the depths of the Great Depression. But we are there again. And it will get worse as pressure on the labor market increases with immigration. The people who suffer first and worst, as I said, are those with the least skills, and that includes many of our minorities, people we have been trying to help with 40 years of social policy. Now, mention briefly the immigration costs of a growing population. It should be obvious to everyone that whatever your standard of living, the more people there are, the more pressure on the environment, on the water systems, on the land, on the forests. The topsoil in the United States, for example, is disappearing 18 times faster than it can be replaced. So little by little, we're wearing down the topsoils on our farms and our food-producing capacity. Part of that, of course, is because we export food. We need that for foreign exchange, and we import oil. Modern agriculture is the process of using land to turn oil into food. At some point, the lines cross, and we cannot afford to feed our own people. This is a further threat from population growth in this country. In the meantime, we all experience the crowding, we experience the decline in education in our schools, we experience many losses in the quality of our lives, and the only people that benefit from this, apparently, are, well, two categories. Those who love cheap labor, the cheap labor lobby. In this connection, I'd like to mention that Grover Norquist, who many of us think of as championing lower taxes, is also a champion of high mass immigration. He worked for higher immigration recently. There's a conflict of interest here because more immigration, more population growth leads us all to higher taxes. How can he be working at the same time for these two causes? Problem. Now, we as a nation know, if we read the polls, that most Americans, and I'm speaking in 70%, 80% of Americans, want less immigration. A very large majority will tell a pollster that they want zero immigration. Now, as a strategist, I have found, and we have all found, looking at what has happened to us, because we have lost each of these last debates in Congress, we have lost by focusing on one category of immigration at a time. We can only win by saying we want a moratorium. And everyone out there and everyone out there can fight about which category gets that allocation of immigrants. The moratorium that we advocate at Population Environment Balance and Carrying Capacity Network is a moratorium of 100,000 a year, period. All-inclusive immigration. This is the victory strategy. You will find petitions for your local government and other leaders on the various tables. And I do urge you to consider going for a moratorium. Bob Stump has a piece of legislation before Congress that asks for a moratorium at a slightly higher number than the one I mentioned. But nevertheless, it is a start. It is a principle that we must all get behind. An all-inclusive cap, a moratorium on immigration. This is what the American people want. I think we, as an organization, and many patriotic organizations are getting behind this objective. Thanks very much.
What I would like to do is to perhaps deal with the problem of immigration, or the debate about immigration in a kind of international perspective. Having done some work on the subject of immigration, or the arguments raging around the subject of immigration in Europe, I think it might be appropriate to sort of compare the European experience to our own, because like the United States, much of the Western world is being overwhelmed by third world immigration, or at least the objections that we hear in the United States are being raised in Europe as well. One common experience, I think, with immigration among Western countries has been the shift from a notion of citizenship which is based on the jus sanguinis, in other words, having parents or ancestors being associated with a country, to what is called the jus soli, which is being a citizen by virtue of being born in a particular territory, being eligible for citizenship by being born in territory. And I think that much of the movement in this direction, at least among the intelligentsia, has been fueled by the war against racism, or the fear of some kind of resurgent fascism that may be inherent in the notion that what determines your nationality is ancestry. The countries which have held out against this longest are perhaps Germany and Switzerland. In the case of Switzerland, because of a tradition of local democracy, in order to become a citizen, I don't know if this remains the law, but certainly until recently, one had to be born, or at least receive the right of citizenship from a canton. In the case of Germany, for a long time, there was a debate raging about the status of the Gastarbeiter, particularly the Turks who were brought there during a period of German economic boom, and whose status as citizens was never quite settled until 1991, when there was legislation passed that allowed those Gastarbeiter who had stayed in Germany to become regularized or naturalized as citizens, though this right would not remain indefinitely in effect for everybody else coming in. Nonetheless, I think there has been this general movement, certainly this general movement in direction of citizenship being dependent on the jus soli, the fact that one is born or resides in a territory, as opposed to the jus sanguinis, which is that one's parents have a particular nationality and therefore one is a citizen by right of blood. Another similarity, I think, is the prevalence of multicultural rhetoric in the press and among the mediocrats. And this is something that one encounters whether one is reading the Italian press, the English press, the American press. And I like to tell people, you know, I pick up the New York Times and read it with delight after becoming mired in the rhetoric of Le Monde or other foreign newspapers, which sound like the New York Times, but even more so. But the multicultural language and the anti-racist charges that we encounter daily in the United States also belong to the rhetorical arsenal of the European press, and politicians there must, you know, contend with some of the same outrageous charges that those on the right must face in the United States. Nonetheless, I think there is a difference in the certainly in the percentage of immigration that the Europeans are looking at and that we're looking at, and I think also in the willingness to deal or to accept fairly large numbers of third world populations or third world immigrants whom one has difficulty assimilating into one's general culture. If you look at the American figures, which were very meticulously presented by Professor Abernathy, you discover that there's 1,200,000 or about 1,200,000 legal immigrants coming to the United States. There are also the so-called illegals who come here, and the figures there are estimated as being in the range of 100,000 to 200,000 a year. In most European countries, well, the other figure that is intended to be appalling, and indeed is appalling, is that since 1965, 2/3 of our increased population has come as a result of third world immigration. In the United States, in France, by contrast, in fact, just about anywhere in Europe, you're looking at third world population influx in the range of about 5 to 7%. In France, the figures may be even lower than that if one takes into account that words like étranger, émigré, do not necessarily refer to third world populations, but can be resident aliens from other parts of Europe, or in the case of the émigré, can be the descendants of Frenchmen living abroad who came back to France. Nonetheless, there does seem to be, a good deal of unhappiness with the presence of a third world population there. And from the 1980s on, there are fairly stringent laws that get passed to deal with the sans-papiers, those who are there illegally. In the late 1980s, you have the Loi Pascal, which has the effect of empowering the French police to escort the sans-papiers back to the border. I've never figured out whether the reconduite à la frontière, bringing them back to the border, means putting them on a plane or escorting them to the, the Spanish border and throwing them over onto the other side. But in any case, the police are empowered to do those sorts of things, and that in 1997, there was the Loi Debré, which was finally, of course, undone by the subsequent socialist administration of Jospin, which really allowed the police to inspect just about anything for illegals. There were harsh penalties inflicted on those who had these sans-papiers working for them, and those with whom they stayed had to report to the police about people whose right to stay or had not been quite clarified, and also had to indicate that they had left. When the police ordered them to leave, they had to leave. Even if they weren't rounded up, if they were allowed to leave on their own, the person with whom they were staying had to accept responsibility that they would go. Now, there's, of course, an outcry in the French papers about this, particularly in Le Monde, to less extent in Le Figaro, but politicians seem to be oblivious to this, at least politicians, from the center rightward. One of the reasons, of course, for this is the looming presence of the Front National before it unfortunately, they've committed suicide because there's a struggle for leadership right now between Maigret and the family of Jean Le Pen, and it's quite possible that it will take them a long time to put their own house in order. But with a party on what is considered to be the extreme right being able to win 15 or 20% of the popular vote, and with something like 1 of every 3 French voters voting for that party in some election, the other parties are put on notice, particularly parties of the right center, that they're going to have to do something to address the immigration problem or else lose even more of their electors. There also, and I think this is perhaps most important, is there is not that much reluctance on the part of French or German politicians, even in some cases on the left, to engage the immigration issue. Back in the 1980s, when Chirac was running as premier for premier of France, or was the leadership of the leader of the right center parties, in one of his speeches in Paris, he made the speech about the Maghrébins, the people from North Africa. He said, I don't know if it was ils sentent mal or ils sentent autrement que nous. They either smell badly or smell differently from us. This did not destroy his political career. He went on to become premier. And I think there's a different mentality. One is willing to address that kind of question. Cultural differences, whether we can remain a French people if this and this percentage of people coming from elsewhere. Even the Germans, with all of the talk of the burdens of their history, even the Germans who are very sensitive about the burden of the Nazi past, will openly address questions of immigration in a way Americans will not. In a way the Canadians will not. And this sort of brings in my last point, which is the nature of political discourse, or shall I call political non-discourse in the United States on immigration or the 10,000 other questions that George Will and the New York Times tell us are no longer open questions, or those things that we've now put behind us because we as a nation have decided blah, blah, blah. Americans seem to be very intimidated about raising these questions. I heard somebody make a point yesterday which actually intrigued me, that many people say, I like those guys, they have guts, but you know, I can't do this. Well, the question is, why can't Americans open their mouths and speak as other people speak about issues of burning social importance? And it's because they really have become, or we have become, a nation of wimps in a way that other peoples have not. This is the reason. There is no other reason. The last point I'd like to raise is the discussion of immigration appropriate for democracy? Because we are told night and day by the media that it is undemocratic to talk about immigration. It is undemocratic for whites to respond to blacks who insult them. It is undemocratic to indicate that most interracial violence is committed by blacks against whites. These are all undemocratic things to say because they are insensitive, and they're insensitive because the media decides that they are insensitive. In the case of immigration, I think it is the most important question that a democratic people can engage. It is a question of who becomes your fellow citizens, who are your neighbors, who are your citizens, and it is an eminently democratic decision to decide we don't need any more citizens in the United States. And here I cite my friend Peter Brimlow, the book Alienation, in which he suggests that having immigrants is a luxury. It is not an economic necessity. The United States can survive quite nicely without further immigration. We probably would survive much better without further immigration than having more immigrants come into our country. But in any case, it is the kind of luxury that deserves to be debated, particularly when the vast majority of the American people consider it to be an important social issue, and were it not for their wimpiness, would be willing to discuss it publicly. And I think it is a kind of issue which is going to come back again and again for all the reasons Professor Abernathy gave. And I think that it would behoove us, as something other than a nation of wimps, to address this issue openly, not only at the Council of Conservative Citizens Annual Conference, but in all political forums. This is the kind of question that should be addressed on the right as well as on the left, because my feeling is that labor union Democrats like Trafficante are much more willing to engage this question than respectable conservatives or neoconservatives who have brushed it under the rug. But it is the kind of question that, for all the reasons Professor Abernathy gave, will come back, for ecological reasons, for cultural reasons, because people don't like brushing up against other people in an increasingly limited social space, that at some point it will become a social issue that even our politicians and journalists will have to treat fairly. Thank you.
Well, I'll use the opportunity to make a brief commercial. I'm Wayne Lutton, editor of The Social Contract, and I'm pleased to say at this conference, not only on this panel, but on this conference, many people who write regularly for The Social Contract, our Journal of Public Affairs, are on the program this year. For those of you who are attending the conference, be sure to stop by the back table and pick up a free copy. It happens we have some copies of a special issue that John Vinson edited for us a year ago dealing with a question of Europhobia. in the immigration debate. And we also have a discussion in here of President Clinton's great speech in which he informed us that if he and his cronies have their way, we will have a very diverse future, a very dark future, perhaps, for America. Also, be sure to pick up a copy of our 1999 book catalog. Many of the people who are speaking at this conference are published authors, and we help distribute their books and are glad to do so. For those of you who are viewing this at home, you can check out our website on the World Wide Web at tscpress.com, or call our office and ask for a copy of our book catalog, and maybe you can even talk them into a free sample issue of the social contract. And you can reach our office at area code 616-347-1171. I'll repeat that at the end of my remarks for those of you who need to grab a pencil. It is a pleasure to be here and to discuss this question as where is the debate going, or are we even having one? In a sense, of course, as other speakers have mentioned before, we really haven't had a debate on the issue of immigration. One reason that there hasn't been a debate is because, frankly, at no time in America's recent history, or even history going back to the early republic, at no time has there been a general demand for more immigration. Any public opinion poll that has ever been taken at any time that polling has been done has shown that there are substantial majorities who have opposed more and liberalized immigration. So that is one of the reasons, in one sense, that there has not been a debate, because there's been a consensus. As long as public opinion polls have been taken, that we don't need more. We need the same or less. On the other side, another reason there has not been a general debate was in a sense indicated by Doris Meisner, President Clinton's head of the Immigration Service. Speaking here in Washington before the Immigration Lawyers Association, she chortled, "We are transforming ourselves." And of course, all the immigration lawyers cheered because that meant more business for them. Actually, Mrs. Meisner would have been more accurate if she had said, "We are transforming you," because that is, in fact, what mass immigration is doing. It is deconstructing America before our very eyes. And yet no one has been asked. No one has been, the politicians haven't gone before the public and said, are you unhappy with your neighborhoods? Do you feel that you have too much clean air? Do you have too much water? Is there not enough traffic in your community? Do you feel that your taxes are too low? That your children don't have enough playmates and classmates? Well, of course, they've never posed these kind of questions, and they don't intend to, because they do know that public opinion polls just generally show, and always have, that the public realizes that population growth is a problem, and to have dissimilar people moving into our communities is a greater problem. And this is for just very natural reasons. That I should mention too that one of the reasons, there's a series of legislative acts that have brought about the situation that we're in today. These are not inevitable conditions at all. The 1924 Immigration Act, which was signed into law by President Coolidge, and which is constantly attacked by immigrationists as being a bad law. The 1924 Immigration Act was a rational response to what was then referred to as Balkanization, which had helped touch off the First World War. And in the wake of the First World War, which had been touched off, as you may recall, by the events in the Balkans, President Coolidge and the Congress overwhelmingly wanted to avert taking place in North America, in the United States, the sort of Balkanization, the kind of ethno conflicts that had helped touch off the Great War. They wanted to avert that. So they very rationally passed the Immigration Act, finally in 1924, after a couple of short-term holding acts. If you take a look at who was promoting the 1924 Immigration Act and what their motivations were, the best motivations possible. They wanted the United States to be free of the kind of ethno-conflicts and also vast economic problems that were plaguing Europe and had before 1914. Objectively, I think the only trouble with the 1924 Immigration Act is that it wasn't enacted, say, in 1884. It was maybe too late, but it's certainly fine legislation, and the 24 Act did have the effect of limiting immigration to about 150,000 a year, and of course the direction of immigration was of people who were much like Americans already in the United States, so that they were much more easy to assimilate. And so it was the destruction of the 1924 Act, its replacement by the 1965 Act, and then 1986 amnesty for aliens who were here helped touch off the large family chain migration that is plaguing us today. Then the 1990 Immigration Act actually increased legal immigration by 40%. So we're looking at three pieces of legislation: the 65 Act, the 1986 amnesty, the 1990 Act. These are all specific pieces of legislation which had the impact of vastly increasing immigration from 150,000 a year, largely from Europe, to 100,200,000 legal immigrants, over 90% of whom come from dissimilar areas, third world areas. And of course, as Glenn Spencer shows on his great website postings there, illegal immigration is not being checked. And when the INS tells us, oh, it's 300,000 a year net, well, they're trying to come up with a figure that maybe won't scare us, because 300,000 doesn't sound near as much as maybe 500,000 or who knows how many are coming across the border, because border security is just broken down. And a lot of this is even related to NAFTA, with the lack of security at our borders. So we have a huge legal immigration problem, which is then added on to illegal immigration. One of the points that I think we need to emphasize to our friends and to those whom we would like to influence, and I think that this is something that is really encouraging when we're trying to promote an understanding of immigration, is that immigration is not a single issue. There is an immigration impact to just about every other issue that our fellow Americans are concerned about. And I think one of the things that we need to do when we're talking to our fellows and even encouraging people to run for office and all is to help people see these links. One indication of what I'm talking about is in the form of a Wall Street Journal poll of a couple of years ago. Their American Opinion quarterly survey of politics, economics, and values. And what the Wall Street Journal did in one of those polls is they looked at what they called the American agenda. What were the issues that adult Americans who they polled were most concerned about? Well, down toward the number 11 on this list of 14 issues was reducing immigration. In other words, and in this poll, 29% of the adults said that this was their number one issue. When asked, what do you think about immigration, as Professor Abernathy pointed out, anytime they take polls, it's always 70, 80% when they're asked, do you want more immigration? Well, no. Do you think that more immigration helps? No. But when people are asked, well, what's your number one issue? Well, in this particular poll, it was improving public education was number one. Number two, reducing crime. Number three, protecting Social Security. Number four, protecting Medicare. Number five, creating jobs and economic growth. Here was another issue. Number six, preventing U.S. jobs from moving overseas. Number seven, reducing the federal deficit. Number eight was reforming welfare, reducing taxes, reforming Social Security. Then reducing immigration was considered the number one issue to about 30% of the adults. Reforming Medicare, protecting the environment, 26% felt that was their most pressing issue, and reforming the campaign finance system was at the bottom. Well, the point, though, is that all of these issues, education, crime, reducing crime was the number two issue, just under education. Actually, they were tied. All of these other issues have an immigration component. So one of the things that I said this years ago, sent memos around, is that we need to be running on this campaign that immigration is not a single issue. And when you're talking to other people, or even some people running for office, and your constituents or your potential audience says, well, we're concerned about education, you could say absolutely, and there is an immigration component to education. As Professor Abernathy pointed out, if you're in California, the cost of building a new school every day is due to immigration. So there's a direct cost. If you're concerned about education, if you're concerned about reducing crime, at any given time, about 25–30% of the federal prison population is made up of the foreign-born, and in some states and counties, it's much higher than that. So, and of course, for example, drug trade is intimately related to the flow of people across our porous borders. So if you're concerned about crime, well, there's obviously an immigration component to crime. There's an immigration component to protecting our Social Security and Medicare, because, of course, it just happens that recent immigrants have a much higher welfare usage than do native-born American citizens. Much higher welfare use. And this consistently so. And also, since so many recent immigrants, third world immigrants, poorly educated people coming with poor skills in the first place, are going to be low wage earners all of their lives and are going to be heavy users, consequently, even in their retirement, more especially in their retirement years, heavy users of public benefits. So that they're actually not only a drain now, but they will be a future drain as well. And it is so on just about all of these issues, reforming welfare, reducing taxes. Well, one of the ways we can help reduce taxes now and in the future is by calling a halt to immigration. So what we need to do is be very positive and forward on these issues, and just remind people, if we want to reduce crime, if we want to lower taxes, if we want to protect the environment, one of the first things we can do is to halt further immigration, because this will have an immediate positive impact on all of these other issues. I think that all of us here, and those of you who are viewing this at home as well, I'm reminded of this term used by a group of Pacific Islanders. They have a word called mokita, M-O-K-I-T-A. Mokita means what everyone knows but no one dares say, or if you wish, the truth that no one speaks. Well, all of us need to speak the truths about immigration. And what we need to be working for, something that just about everyone agrees with, at least 70–80% of our fellow adult Americans, is that we all need to reaffirm that America is not merely a geographic expression. America, there are American people with American values, and they're worth upholding and preserving for the future and passing on to future generations. Thanks for having had me as a guest. And I'll repeat the website. It's tscpress.com, or call 616-347-1171. We'll be glad to send you a catalog. And as I mentioned, just about everyone speaking at this conference this weekend, they have something in print, and we help distribute it. So please call us. Thanks again.
That gave me an idea, the commercial. What I'm about to say is documented on a videotape called Immigration Threatening the Bonds of Our Union. And a transcript of that is available on our website, which is www.americanpatrol.com. John mentioned that Mario Obledo had said something about leaving California. I want to give you a taste of what's on our website and reinforce what he said.
Also made the statement that California is going to become a Hispanic state, and that if anyone doesn't like it, they should leave. Did you say that? I did.
Okay. That's Mario Obledo. We'll talk a little bit about who he really is a little later. California, as often been said, is America's future. Let me tell you about your future. Between 1979 and 1994, there were 7,288 gang killings in Los Angeles, according to the Journal of the American Medical Association. On May 1st of this year, 1999, Malcolm Klein, a professor of criminology at USC, was asked if the gang problem is getting better. He said, no, it's getting worse, much worse. On July 1st of this year, David Tarkovsky, a member of the Los Angeles Unified School District and a liberal, got up at a swearing-in ceremony and said that the Los Angeles schools were now at the 20th percentile in the United States, that they were approaching 50% dropout, the children could not read, and that Americans were fleeing his district and the state of California because of the school system. Last week in Iowa, Pat Buchanan pointed out that 90% of the domestic violence crime in Iowa was directly linked to methamphetamines coming in from Mexico. In Salt Lake City, 80% of the drug felony arrests are illegal aliens, mostly from Mexico. In Wyoming, the director of public safety said their greatest problem was illegal immigration and gangs from Mexico. This is your future. In 1994, I was one of the lead defenders of Proposition 187 in California. I appeared up and down the radio dial and debated Prop 187 with the best they had to offer, including Senator Polanco, the state of California, state Senate, and a couple of lawyers from the National Lawyers Guild, once described by Congress as the legal arm of the Communist Party in the United States. This was Peter Shea and Linda Wong. When they voted overwhelmingly to pass Proposition 187, and by the way, 20% of Latinos voted for it, the California voters knew exactly what they were doing. This was the most hotly debated issue in the state's history. 4 years later, Democrat Gray Davis was elected governor of California. Many said this was a repudiation of Pete Wilson and Prop 187. Nothing could be further from the truth. Dan Lundgren lost the election because he refused to talk about immigration. He refused to raise the issue. He had the issue, but he didn't have Pete Wilson's courage. Writing in the Sacramento Bee on September 23, 1998, respected political analyst Dan Walters asked why neither Dan Lundgren nor Gray Davis would talk about the impact of immigration on the state that was facing gridlock, that was facing environmental catastrophe, that was facing a destroyed school system. Why wouldn't they talk about it? It was a rhetorical question that was never answered. Lundgren was reluctant to talk about immigration and its impacts on California because, in part, he was responsible for it. On our video, you will see him proudly proclaim that as a member of the House of Representatives, he was on the Immigration Subcommittee for 8 years, and that he was the one who convinced other Republicans to grant amnesty to 3 million illegal aliens. So the problems that California was facing were in large measure due to Dan Lundgren. So he couldn't talk about it, or he didn't want to. But the Republicans otherwise have unilaterally disarmed. I'd like to give you an example of how that happened. I became embroiled in California's 24th congressional district race to replace Democrat Tony Bielenson. And this happened when Brad Sherman, who was the Democrat running for office, was behind in the polls. Suddenly, he attacked his opponent, Rich Seibert, as a racist because he had appeared at Voice of Citizens Together meetings and spoke. And on what basis did they make that claim? After 6 years of research into 6 years of our newsletters and our meetings and all of this material, they found a document. They found it. Buried in our webpage was a letter I wrote one time that was never published. And in it, I said, the problem we have with phony documents in California can be linked to a characteristic of the Mexican culture, a characteristic Mexicans who assimilate drop. That was racist. And Rich Seibert was a racist. And so Brad Sherman joined with the Anti-Defamation League and ran a huge campaign against him and against me. The LA Times came out, and I spoke with them at a meeting, and they asked me, they waved this letter at me. And I said, yes, I wrote it, but if you look at Andres Oppenheimer's book, Bordering on Chaos, he's a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, praised by the LA Times, he says the same thing. And so does the president of Mexico. But the LA Times ran the story. They didn't repeat what I said. They didn't repeat my defenses. They said nothing. They printed letters in the LA Times attacking me for this outrageous statement, but would not print my letters in defense. We had to buy an ad in the LA Times in which we had letters supporting us from a Jewish doctor, a Latino lawyer, an Oriental businessman, and an Indian leader. The Indian leader, because, by the way, if you saw recently, they're going to drill for oil on the Blackfeet Indian Reservation. I'm proud to say I was the general manager of the seismic company that did the exploration up there. I'm also proud to say that I was the general manager of the second largest Indian-owned and Indian employer in the United States. And I have a proud record of working with the minorities in that regard. And the Indian leader who wrote this letter said, I am shocked that they would suggest that you are a racist. Don't they know who you are? Don't they know your history? They didn't care. But Rich Seibert lost by a small percentage. They played the race card, and they won. In 1998, Dan Lundgren had a war chest of $48 million versus 33 million for Gray Davis. He had lots of cards to play, but he threw them in, bet the $48 million, and threw in his cards. Let's talk about what cards he was handled. He could have told the voters that Art Torres, chairman of the California Democratic Party, had said the following.
Remember, 187 is the last gasp of white America in California.
Remember, Proposition 187 is the last gasp of white America in California. And he said it in public, and the media wouldn't repeat it. He could have told voters that what he really meant was that Americans are losing the demographic war with Mexico, beginning with California. He could have also said, and we have this on tape, that Art Torres, chairman of the California Democratic Party, said that I tell my white friends they better hold on to affirmative action because they're going to need it. In other words, when the Mexicans take over, they're going to discriminate against you. In 1998, Mario Obledo, co-founder of the Mexican-American Legal Defense Fund, MALDEF, backed by the Ford Foundation, stated publicly, as I just played, that California is going to be a Hispanic state and anyone who doesn't like it should leave. Does that sound like ethnic cleansing? Do you know what Bill Clinton did for Mario Obledo in 1998? He gave him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Obledo was the man who threatened terrorism against a billboard that John was talking about, and they had to remove it. He might have used that $48 million to tell the California voters that Angel Pescador Osuna, the Mexican consul general in Los Angeles, got in front of a law school and said that Mexico was conquering California. He called it La Reconquista. The New York Times picked it up and printed it on a front page story, April 14th, 1998, during the campaign for governor. But Dan Lundgren said nothing. He could have exposed Antonio Villaraigosa, Speaker of the California Assembly, and Cruz Bustamante, Democrat candidate for lieutenant governor, for supporting the Mexican conquest of California. He could have, but he didn't. But that wasn't the half of it. He should have told them that immigration and illegal immigration had all been destroyed California's schools, was leading to statewide gridlock, destruction of farmland, and serious environmental problems. He could have explained that trade with Mexico was a sham, that NAFTA, all NAFTA had done was suck Mexicans up to our border for eventual crossing. All it had done is create an environmental disaster on our border, where cities like Ciudad Juarez and Tijuana are nothing but cesspools now spilling into the United States. 80% of our trade with Mexico goes to those maquiladoras plants. 80% of their trade with us comes out of them. There's what economists call an entrepot. It's just a place where stuff stays and then comes back. The idea that we have a big trade with Mexico is a joke. It isn't happening. And by the way, I read in the paper yesterday that Mexicans are hijacking trucks, shipping NAFTA goods, and stealing $10 billion a year off those trucks. That was in yesterday's Washington Times. Lundgren lost the race in California because he was silent on the issues. And now we are facing the consequences. Legislation is moving through the state legislature, which will essentially create a sanctuary for Mexicans in California, and to pay for them once they get here. We expect soon that Cinco de Mayo and the Mexican Independence Day will be state holidays. Antonio Villaraigosa once told a gathering of Latinos, any Latino who is elected to state office and doesn't support granting driver's licenses to illegal aliens shouldn't belong there. He said that 2 years ago. Hilda Solis introduced legislation just to do just that, and the state assembly passed it, to grant driver's licenses, and that also means voting. Unfortunately, it's been tied up in a state Senate committee. Now listen to this. On May 1, 1999, Governor Gray Davis said, "In the near future, people will look at California and Mexico as one magnificent region." That's the governor of California. It's a violation of the Constitution of the United States for any state to enter into a treaty or alliance with another country. And that's what he's doing. And that's what Cruz Bustamante is doing. And that's what Antonio Villaraigosa is doing. The Republicans could have debated the real issues, but didn't. Bill Clinton attacked Yugoslavian ethnic cleanser Milosevic, but awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom to a Mexican ethnic cleanser. He used U.S. troops to confirm the Albanians' claim on Kosovo, but won't use U.S. troops to deny Mexico's claims on California. In 1997, Mexican President Ernesto Zedillo said, quote, "I have proudly affirmed that the Mexican nation extends beyond the territory enclosed by its borders."
I have proudly affirmed that the Mexican nation extends beyond the territory enclosed by its borders.
What do you think he meant by that? In the current issue of Newsweek magazine, the publisher of Latina magazine says the United States of the 21st century will be undeniably ours again. It is manifest destino. And she means it. In his farewell speech given to the Corps of Cadets at West Point, General Douglas MacArthur said, "But always in our ears ring the ominous words of Plato, that wisest of all philosophers, only the dead have seen an end to war." America was built on the age of reason, the age of Newton. Our ascent has been the ascent of man, but there is no guarantee that this ascent will continue. Robert Kaplan of Atlantic Monthly said that no great nation was ever founded by optimists. We must be realistic about the future. We must be concerned about the Mexican people and all the people of the world, but we must do what we can to help, but not at the expense of our nation. For if she is lost, the silence in the sky suggests that our galaxy may not have the stuff to create another America. So let the debate begin, and by all means, let the American people decide their own fate. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Can I get you all together?
Anybody has some questions?
Take questions, please. Take questions.
Now we're going to have a question and answer session. If you would like to address a question to one of us, please stand and indicate which one of us you want to direct the question to. I'll recognize you as you stand.
Are you pointing?
Yes.
To the entire panel, I'd like to, this is more of a statement than a question. I'd like to point out that as the amnesties for illegal aliens brought on the chain immigration of bringing families in and extended families and so on and so forth, we can actually, when we say legal immigrants, as far as I'm concerned, those that were brought in on the coattails of the amnesty are not legal. They may be technically legal or legislatively legal, but they're really not legal. So when we say legal immigrants, we must qualify by stating that these are legal immigrants who came in on the coattails of illegal immigrants that were amnestied. And that number increases as we go along.
Sir, that point is very well taken. A study has been done recently which found that immigrants in recent years have a high percentage of people who entered the U.S. illegally and then applied for legal residence. So the line between legal and illegal is being blurred to a significant extent. The amnesties were nothing but a total disaster, just a complete and total disaster, just a destruction of our rule of law. The same point I was making, in a third world society, it's might makes right. In our society, it has been rule of law, and amnesty has weakened our rule of law. Yes, sir.
I hope I'm not raining on anybody's parade, but somebody has to bring up this issue. To what extent is the Jewish community responsible for promoting our open border policy?
May I say something? I want to say this, and I want to make it very clear, that some of the greatest supporters of our organization were Jewish. The gal upon which I based so much of our research, Dr. B. Meredith Burke, is not only Jewish, she's liberal, was a member of the free speech movement. Shirley Lertzman was our co-founder. She was a member of the LA County Grand Jury for 17 years. It was her contacts with Mark Tajima of the LA County Welfare Department that got us the information that allowed us to move ahead. I believe that there is a large group in the left of the Jewish people in the left part of the spectrum who are very concerned with being kind to strangers. Okay, that's part of the text, but we should be very, very careful because we have been accused of being a front for Jewish organizations. So our experience is there is an element of truth in what you're saying, but it is not generally applicable generally, and we have many Jewish supporters.
May I say one quick thing? I read Kevin McDonald's book, and he said that for 60 years, the Jews have fought tooth and nail against this legislation. That there's three pieces of legislation. My final point is, what newspaper, TV station, or any other means of mass media will state our point of view, and who controls that media?
Yeah, let me comment on that, because I wrote a very long review of Kevin McDonald's work for which only Social Contract, by the way, would publish. I think that the points McDonald raised are very well taken. I would not deny those things for a second. The problem that you have to ask yourself is, why does the vast majority of Christian Americans accept the same attitudes? Why are they so non-resistant to this? And one of the points that McDonald keeps raising in his book is, well, you know, Jews are a lot brighter than white Gentiles, and therefore they go along with this sort of stuff. Well, the question you have to ask yourself: were Polish peasants more intelligent than the Jews living there, who were discriminated against, whom they ignored? If Polish Jews had demanded open borders in Poland, they probably would have been put in insane asylums there. I mean, you have to have a host nation that is receptive to this kind of argument about open borders in order for minorities to be able to prevail when they make that argument. And as I always tell people, I work at a very liberal Protestant college where the people sound a lot crazier than Jewish liberals, and most of them are identified with a Christian church in the name of which they speak. I went to one event given at our college where the chaplain asked God's forgiveness for this group, for all of us, for what we did to promote the Holocaust. And everybody, you know, meekly bowed his or her head to ask God's forgiveness for something in which these people were not remotely involved. So I think what you're dealing with is what I call uncharitably the phenomenon of general brain death, in which people go along with this sort of stuff and don't tell those that you should have open borders because otherwise you're insensitive and you're fascist and you're anti-Semites, blah, blah, blah. Well, the question is, why does the majority go along with this ripoff all the time? And that, I think, is a much more relevant and pressing question in the end than why do groups which want to disrupt the majority culture, whether it's Jews or people from Central Asia or wherever, why are they allowed to succeed? And the answer, I think, is some kind of pathology within the general culture, which American conservatives, and particularly people on what I suppose the media would consider the far right, have thus far been unwilling to address efficiently. Because if there were not this receptiveness to multicultural arguments, to all the guilt trips that are being laid on the majority white culture, then the arguments of the multiculturalists would never have come to prevail.
I think that the Jewish people who are with us wanting to stop mass immigration are very aware of some other facet, and I wish that they would be more generally ambassadors to the Jewish community in order to try to change the general opinion within that community. And a woman who is very active in this in Arizona, Susu Levy, has said, how is it that I, speaking of Susu Levy, have no Jewish friends? She says, why do more Jewish people not understand that this enormous population growth, environmental destruction, and economic dislocation being caused by immigration, how is it that the Jewish people do not realize that in creating this, they are sowing the seeds of their own future destruction? There is a very great need for Jewish people who agree with us that mass immigration must stop, for them to be ambassadors to their own community. It's very hard for anyone else to do it. If we try to do it, it is perceived as a threat when it is not that. So people who are Jewish must be ambassadors to their own community to try to help us stop mass immigration.
Sam.
Just a comment on Dr. Gottfried's remarks. I don't really think there is a receptiveness among the general population to multiculturalism or a sympathy for this sort of culturally destructive thing. It's simply fear. People are afraid to criticize it, whether they're rationally or not. In some cases, it is a rational fear because you can, as we were discussing last night, you can be ruined professionally for criticizing these things. And in some cases, the fear is exaggerated. But I don't see any. I don't see any carrot, so to speak. I think it's all stick that explains the silence of most people on these things.
May I respond to that? I have problems with that. That this is all the stick, and it's these people are afraid. You're talking about a majority culture of hundreds of millions of people. Why is everybody afraid? I also keep running into people who use politically correct language when talking to me. I think I've sort of reached the point where I hear people in men's gyms using politically correct language. And I do not understand. It may be the nature of the modern welfare state, what I write books on, the socializing success of the administrative state. But I see a lot of wimpiness out there. And I see entirely unjustified fear. So you take a hit, you don't get a job, you organize. I mean, everybody in this room has probably, suffered the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune at some point, but you're not going to be hauled off to a concentration camp. I do not understand the degree to which the American majority allows itself to be silenced.
Well, as I say, sometimes it's rational, sometimes
As a third-generation Irish American whose family did assimilate, I've noticed in Chicago and in the North the proactive stance that the Catholic Church has taken, more progressively liberal, on immigration. And my question is, did the Church play an active role advocating immigration in California during 187 in these past two elections?
The answer is absolutely. And I'd like to point to something else that I think should be discussed. We're talking about religions. This year, the Pope visited Mexico, and La Opinion had a big color picture of the Pope in his first Mass given in Mexico. And hanging behind the Pope was an enormous Mexican flag. And in the caption, the La Opinion said this was an expression of unbridled nationalism. At the same time, the Pope issued an encyclical that said that all human beings have the right to cross any border. So you have a philosophy there from the top that the borders should be opened. And then, if I may get into this, and it's going to be a little tough, hello, America. But Catholic Charities, which is the largest, charitable organization in the United States, gets 65% of its money from taxpayers. Not too many people know that. And they will fight for the rights of immigrants. So the Catholic Church is certainly from the top, on record, saying they support open borders. Now, I would be surprised if they didn't use some of those billions of dollars that they get from the taxpayers to support that philosophy.
There was a statement made earlier about greed and treason. I was wondering if anyone on the panel would want to comment about the exploitation of the immigration situation. I'm talking about the person who mows your lawn for $10 less, or the illegal who washes dishes, up to Microsoft, who imports Pakistani programmers at considerably less than what they would pay an American counterpart. I think this contributes tremendously to the immigration problem that we have.
Sure. You've all heard of the Cato Institute, I'm sure, and you've all heard of Steve Moore, and he's awfully good on economics, but he's not so good on immigration. I debated Steve once, and this was in the early days of our debates, which have been ongoing, and the best he could come up with in support of immigration was, what was his wife do without a nanny? She couldn't go out to work if she didn't have a nanny. And in fact, employers do very well out of cheap labor. That was the point I made earlier. And the employers do include that professional class which uses nannies, live-in help, gardeners, and so forth. We are paying for this cheap help we get in our taxes, in our population growth, which leads to environmental degradation, and we will regret it desperately.
For the panel, this proposal was made that we have a moratorium on immigration of 100,000 a year. To me, a moratorium means no immigration for a while until we decide how many there should be. So I'd like to ask the panelists, would you like a moratorium of 0, or would you like a moratorium of 100,000 or 200,000 or what? Because I personally think it should be 0.
I would even expand on, of course, we're a diverse group up here, and Professor Hart, I would even go beyond your suggestion of 0. I would like to see many people deported. In fact, let me propose a slogan to take out of this meeting: deportation now.
I would add that there was a tremendous pressure being put on Congress now to grant amnesty to 5 million people in the United States. They're granting rolling amnesty. And as the demographers, and I will tell you that if that is done, that would end the United States. There was no, absolutely, if they granted amnesty, which Jose Jacques Medina, the Mexican lawyer, has been advancing in the United States for a number of years, called Proposition 1. If that is successful, it is all over. There will be no United States of America within a very short period of time. I think 100,000 is a good objective. But I also, well, I don't know if I should say this, Peter Brimelow has said it in his book. Pat Buchanan has said that if he was elected president, he would repatriate every illegal alien in the United States. But that won't be easy.
I think one of the stupidest misinterpretations of any amendment we have to the Constitution is the 14th Amendment. And how can we repatriate people that are here when they've had children and their children are now automatically citizens? So consequently, they stay. What are we going to do about this, and when is it going to be done? I mean, it's about time that we had congressmen that did something about this and amended the 14th Amendment. It's a complete misinterpretation of what the original founders of the Constitution intended it to be.
You're absolutely right. There's legislation now before the House to do just that. It's H.R. 73. And I suggest that everyone in here contact his or her congressman or woman to have that representative endorse or co-sponsor this legislation. It's long overdue.
As an ex-immigrant, I want to say something because I think you have touched upon it, but there's something very important that needs to be said. I was born in Argentina of a Southern Confederate Virginia mother and an Argentine father. I lived there until I was 19, and I came to this country, married an American from Alabama, and I have a son who's treasurer of the Sons of Confederate Veterans here. So I've lived in both cultures, the Hispanic culture and here. And what horrifies me, because I grew up under a culture in which might makes right, which was the government of Perón, I see here not only that might makes right, but that the Latin Americanization of the United States in the mentality of American citizens, the thing that scares me the most is the notion of group rights, which exists in all of Latin America and which goes all the way back to Spain, which is the rights of the army, the rights of the church, the rights of the landowners, very strong in our tradition. And individual rights have never been strong in the Spanish tradition or in Latin America. And what we have here now is group rights pushing aside individual rights, which is the greatest invention of the United States. And that, as a totally assimilated, I think, a patriotic American, is one of the things that scares me the most.
I think your points are very well taken. We've got to get over this idea that all cultures are equal and equally beneficial. That just simply isn't true. And the fact that so many people want to flee their cultures is proof of this fact. If their cultures are so good, then why do they want to come here?
Yeah, Baron Brown from Indiana. Why doesn't the Council of Conservative Citizens just take a platform and say American nationals that are Christian, right, follow and adopt the Bible principles that we've got in the books, it's been there forever, right, and just stay that way, and the rest of them just get out? I mean, why do they have to be there? Why don't we have zero immigration? Why don't we deport them? Why don't we use the force that we've got with our own people to do these things that need to be done? We can all see it. We've read the books. We know what the Judeo-Christian concepts are and where it comes from. We know the difference, like he was pointing out. On the Jewish issue, you always talk about Jews, but you never separate them. You never say Khazarian Jews versus Sephardic. You see what I'm trying to say here? The deal is this council needs to address the bottom line. Cut to the quick. Let's get to it. Let's do those things and say those things that separate us from them. The ones that separate those that are, ones that are supposed to be here, who were given this land, and those people that just come and take it. American nationals that are Christians. That's enough. That's all we need here.
One problem with that is that I don't think we can throw out all non-Christians, or should we even want to. I know personally there's several atheists here, and I don't think we'd want to throw them out.
I want to add an element to what the lady said a moment ago. Her words were very well said, but in addition to fleeing their culture, I believe when we're talking about Mexicans specifically, they're fleeing their economy. If you go back many decades, and this has, in my opinion, been a missing part of this debate, you go back many decades, and Mexico is a relatively strong country, and we have allowed an economic infrastructure to take shape which does not recognize borders, does not recognize the rights of people, does not recognize the environment. It only recognizes the almighty dollar, the bottom line. And we have allowed a handful of multinational corporations and banks to make an economic vassal state out of Mexico, not to mention others, to the point where a lot of Mexicans now live in poverty and figure that, hey, the worst that the U.S. has to offer has got to be better than the best that I have here. Why do we not have this subject as a bigger part of this debate? We seem to be too concerned about blaming the Mexicans for coming across the border like they want to do it just to aggravate us, when there's this deeper issue involved. That's not part of this debate now. Why?
May I answer that just very briefly? I would like to say that I think our economic policies in Mexico have been a disaster. It is one of the most corrupt nations on the face of the earth. Between 1991 and 1994, there were more billionaires made in Mexico. There were probably 24, I think, Oppenheimer says. They're now the fourth ranking in terms of the number of billionaires. Since NAFTA, the income of the average Mexican is down 25%. But I want to point something out to you. In a recent Roper poll down in Mexico, they reported that many Mexicans don't believe that that border should be there because this land was stolen from them. And this is a common belief. And all of the polls show it. So you have a problem created in Mexico by corruption, and it is a serious problem. I don't know how to deal with it, but I don't think we can sacrifice the United States in order to do it. I think we have to close the border, and we have to quarantine them and say, you better clean up your act.
Tell us how and why the strictures and purpose of the 1965 Immigration Act were changed and subverted?
They really weren't changed and subverted. We were simply lied to when the advocates of that act pushed through the legislation. It was said that the numbers would never be more than 300,000, but the provisions of that act were for family reunification, and that led inevitably to chain migration and more each year. In other words, there were preferences established. To begin, first there were allocations by region of the world and country, and then once people were here, they were allowed to bring in various categories of relatives. And after 5 years, when each person became a citizen, if he wished or she wished, it became possible to bring in more and more relatives without limit. And this is the chain migration. There, as I said, preferences so that it's members of the nuclear family that can be brought in by citizens, naturalized citizens, without limit. And then they have preferences to bring in adult brothers and sisters on a more rationed basis. But nevertheless, it has been estimated that each seed immigrant is responsible for the migration of 17 more. And that is why the 1965 Act, with family unification as its a founding rationale, has led to this enormous amount of immigration, plus the amnesty, plus the 1990 legislation, which increased legal numbers by 40%.
Yes, this is directed to Professor Abernathy. I'm Paul Fromm of the Canada First Immigration Reform Committee. We recently commissioned the Decima people to do a poll for us, and we found a majority of Canadians supported the idea of a total moratorium on immigration. And perhaps I'm nitpicking here, but if you have a moratorium of 100,000, would you not set off an unholy catfight as to who will have dibs on that 100,000? Whereas if you make it, cut it all off, you will not have the problems of people saying, well, it's racist, or it's anti-family, or it's this or that. It's the same for everybody. No more get in.
You have a very good point. And the activist I referred to earlier, Susu Levy, says we must detain and deport, and of course have zero immigration. And I'm very much in sympathy with that position. On the other hand, about 150,000 or 200,000 Americans, including former immigrants, do leave each year. Really, 100,000 is an arbitrary low number which would allow the population to stabilize. But I would certainly entertain zero as a goal.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to cut off questions now. I just want to make some final comments. All of you are thinking about the things that we've been talking about today, and unfortunately, though, most of us can't have any direct influence over our legislators on this. But there is one thing we can do, and that is to think in terms of our children and grandchildren. One of the goals of the multi-cultist is to take our children and to twist their minds into believing that this is an evil country, an evil civilization. I've talked to a number of public school teachers around the country, and they say that this is definitely the agenda. It makes me think, this situation makes me think of something I read several years back. It was about the country of Lithuania, and when the Soviet Empire fell, the Lithuanians began sprouting flags everywhere and up and praising their national culture. And one reporter was interested in this. He said, how could this be after so many years of Soviet rule that so many people would have these patriotic feelings? And he interviewed one elderly woman, and she said, the reason is that every evening we grandmothers went to our grandchildren and we taught them the glories of Lithuania. Ladies and gentlemen, let's teach our children and our grandchildren the glories of America and our heritage. Thank you.
You want us to line up over here? We're going to line up over here so we can take our picture. Is that all right?
Excuse me, Glenn. We're going to be taking a half-hour break. Please be back here at 11 o'clock. So you gives you time to check out, get coffee, whatever. But please listen to me. Please be back here at 11 o'clock for Joe Sobrin's speech. Thank you.